Firstly, Andrea, thanks so much for having me in the MMF. I think we're going to have a lot of fun. I really love what producers do. So really happy to have Mike with me as well and talk about producer agreements. I'm really nerdy when it comes to music law and this stuff. So I want everyone to ask questions and have a good discussion here. I'm a Canadian entertainment lawyer. I'm based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and primarily my practice focuses on talent. So I work a lot with producers and songwriters, performers, artists, and more generally, anyone that creates creative content. So I act for influencers as well, and authors, and other folks in the creative spaces. I have a background in music. I grew up playing piano and drums and guitar and all that stuff. So I figured when I went to law school, it was only a matter of time before I ultimately got into music. And I also have a company called Ocean Town Music, which focuses on providing management services and some live promotion and that sort of stuff. So it's a little bit about me. How's that, Andrea? Is that good? Short and snappy.
I loved it. I love short and snappy. Thank you. All right, Mike Sonier, music producer extraordinaire. Could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mike Sonier. Happy to be here. I am a producer and a songwriter from Toronto. I live in Los Angeles now, specifically in Burbank with my wife and children. I've been in the game for a minute. I started probably like most people in my basement as a teenager, playing instruments and playing in bands and just trying to do my thing as a producer. And when I eventually ended up at Western University where I studied music, and I brought my rig to university, and sort of the rest was history, and began my career recording and writing with artists around Toronto for many years. And I love what I do. I love helping people write songs. I also have my own little creative venture that I've begun to develop called Somebody Call Everybody. And that is my own company that I'm trying to expand into other creative ventures, and using my skills as a producer and a creative to help artists in a bigger way with a bigger platform than just maybe my studio. So happy to be here.
Amazing. Interesting. I like this.
Yeah.
Also, Mike's being a little modest. Like, his credits are ridiculous. I won't list them all and make him really uncomfortable, but important for everybody to understand. Like, he's written across genres. He's collaborated across genres as a producer, a co-writer, also a performer on different albums. Like, he's worked with people including like Noah Cyrus's July, which was like billions of streams, Maggie Rogers, casually brilliant songwriter. Also like collaborated with artists like Usher, Mustafa the Poet, Toronto's Own or Scarborough's Own, Jesse Reyes, Camila Cabello, Lennon Stella, Ruth B. Like, it just kind of goes on, and as
been
well
a
as like,
been a journey.
I know. I just want people to understand that you've
Thank you. Yeah.
that you've really worked on some amazing projects. So yeah, again, super grateful that you're here. So while I have you here, Mike, let's just start with the basics. So I know this is gonna this could be a long answer or a very short answer, but if you could just talk about, like, what do you see as the role of a producer? What is a producer?
Yeah. Simply, or not so simply, a producer is a multitude of things. They are a collaborator, they are a technician, they are a songwriter, they are a companion in the studio, and from a larger viewpoint, they are somebody perhaps with a unique perspective or a set of skills or musical styling that is unique to them, who sort of makes the effort when collaborating to establish trust at the end of the day. And that trust then leads to the producer and artist, or whoever's in the room, to explore music in a way that may not be so familiar to the artist. They're there to help push you out of your comfort zone, to develop a set of standards or guidelines for operation. But ultimately, they're also there to create a safe space for all of this to happen, while being tasked with, in some capacity, depending on the type of role the producer's in, seeing the project or song to its completion and delivering that product to the label, the artist, the management, all of the above.
Wonderful. Okay, so building on that question,
Yeah.
Let's talk about how you've seen that role change maybe over the years.
The role has changed a lot over the years, but in terms of what maybe be required at the core, not so much. You know, we've always been there as a companion to the creative process, but there really is a distinct kind of difference, at least in my opinion, from the old maybe 1940s to 1990s producer and 1990s to now producer. And yeah, there's a lot of maybe in betweens. But if you think about the 40s and onward, with the development of producers, it was sort of this blend of the executive and the creative. It was these A&R departments developing within labels that now had somebody with maybe the keys to the project, and they had budgets, big budgets. They had the best session musicians in the world. And it's not that we don't have these now, but sort of around the development in the late 80s of the MPC and home recording capabilities, very expensive at the time, but not necessarily so crazy that they aren't comparable to what somebody needs to spend today to start their production. You sort of have this move from the George Martin, Arif Martin, Quincy Jones, Butch Vig director role to maybe this person with a space, younger, laptop, multi-instrumentalist, doing maybe upwards of 50% of the music, in some cases perhaps writing even to the hooks. If you think about somebody like Pharrell or a Max Martin, it's very different than if you look at somebody like Quincy Jones, who, yes, they have writing, but their role was a little bit more of that overseer, that conductor, that top to bottom. We need 800 songs to get to 5. And, you know, that has created a lot of different roles for a producer to fill now. And I think the producers of today are required to have a different set of skills, perhaps, maybe even the same set of skills, but they need to have the additional set of skills of, you need to work a computer. I'm not sure if you could be a producer in today's day by just showing up with your suit and tie on and kind of going, okay, I'm the producer, and there's my orchestra, and there's my engineer, and here's my studio. And so you need to have a certain toolbox of modern day contemporary abilities to work with modern day artists. And lastly, I would say, I think the producers are also a lot younger now as well. You would have, Quincy or George Martin were well into their later years when they were working with Michael or the Beatles. I mean, Quincy, I think, was 50 when he did Thriller. There's a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, a lot of depth there. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen today, but today you might have an 18-year-old with a laptop in their mom's basement, and they're making incredible stuff that everybody wants. And that is just a difference now. And they maybe don't need to be a gifted orchestrator, but they're gifted at orchestrating this new world. So I'll leave it there for that.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And you're just leading me down the path of these questions. So it's perfect. So I think really related to that, it's like, talking about a team and, having somebody on your team with some, more business acumen, especially, speaking about some newer, greener producers. So what do you think about the question, does a producer even need a manager?
Good question. I guess I have, in my experience, thought the word need to be a kind of dangerous word, because we all feel we need something, but need can be very much rooted in emotion. And so I believe it may be a matter of when do you need a manager?
Yeah.
And I think it's important to look at your business and what is needed in that business. What resources do you need that you do not have? And is a manager the best person to fill that role? Or is it a publisher? Is it a lawyer? Is it a combination of all of them? But I have at times in my career have felt that I need a manager. And that has not always been the best place feeling wise to approach that subject from. And so I think it's important to look at it objectively and quantitatively and take sort of the emotion out of it. And then ask yourself, what does my business need?
Exactly.
What does the next step in my life need?
Yeah, exactly. Because a good manager should be a partner in your business. Yes. Matt, as somebody who works across the industry, what are your thoughts on when a producer may need to start working with a manager?
Yeah, no, for sure. So firstly, I agree with everything Mike just said. I guess from my perspective, whether we're talking about a producer, whether we're talking about an artist, performer, songwriter, whoever it may be in the music space, I think the starting point is maybe a practical question. So for example, are you spending more time during 9 to 5 or the later hours working on admin, paperwork, royalty collection, all that sort of stuff when you could be out working and doing sessions and writing and focusing on the creative aspect of your career. The other aspect is if you don't have sort of the accolades under your belt, but you maybe have the talent, do you have a hard time sort of getting in, quote, those rooms? Do you have a hard time working, and are you doing like 2 to 4 sessions a week, or are you doing like 1 a month? So I think it depends, to Mike's point, what you need, maybe at what stage of your career you're at. But generally, I find when I have that conversation with artists, if they're asking, me, the lawyer, their opinion on that, I typically say, well, how much of your time are you spending on admin? How much money is coming in? Are you incorporated? Are there other business items that you need to sort of manage and deal with? Are there maybe some tax issues? And, to Mike's point, maybe it's not the traditional manager, maybe it's a combination. Maybe it's a combination of someone doing sort of, maybe business management or legal, or maybe there's a publisher in the equation that can, satisfy some of those roles. So, so I think it's a long-winded way of saying, I don't know, but I think it's going to come down to maybe the starting point is that practical question about how much of your day are you spending on non-creative ventures, and would it be helpful to have someone to manage that with you and to help you with that. And keep in mind that, if you do sign up paperwork or have some kind of management arrangement, it's likely going to be a 15-20% kind of gross commission. So obviously that's got to be factored in. Is there enough money coming in where that's justified? Other aspects is if you already have lots of money coming in, well, the manager, stepping in on day one, be getting 15-20% of all that income that's already coming in, which is generally the case. So there's lots of discussions, I think, to have up front whenever a manager comes into the picture. But yeah, as a starting point, it's, how much of your day is spent on non-creative ventures, and would another party, another music partner help you out?
Great. And just a quick follow up onto what you're saying, Matt, just to clarify for everybody, generally speaking, would a management agreement between a manager and a producer be similar to, or basically the same as an agreement between a manager and an artist or band?
So I think generally it's going to look similar. Yeah, generally it's going to look similar. It's not to say that it can't deviate from sort of what you'd normally expect, but yeah, normally you're going to, have a sort of term, maybe there could be options. Managers, likely going to want a commission on all revenue and query whether or not that's appropriate or not. And I think also when it comes to sort of the roles and responsibilities, I mean, again, query whether that manager needs maybe specific skills and contacts to help put a producer to work, as opposed to maybe a performer or someone strictly focused on songwriting. So that may not necessarily change the agreement itself, but it might, I think for sure, change sort of the skill set of the manager that producer is going to be looking for. And Andrea, if I could do one thing, and hopefully this doesn't mess up the recording, what I'd love to do is everyone on the call, I'd love to get a sense of, sure, Mike and Andrea would as well. I'd like to know sort of who you are. So if in the chat, you know, if you could do this, I'm serious, people, if you could put 1, if you're a manager, 2, if you're a producer, and then maybe 3, if you're more of a performer, artist, songwriter. Okay, cool. So far a little bit of a
Can I
big
jump
mix.
in?
Yes, Mike, please do.
Just expanding off that, I think, and I may have said this in a way already, but you know, one way to look at this too is also understanding what you need and then letting that determine who that person is to fill that role and how they're going to fill it. Bringing anybody on to a team sometimes may feel like everything is going to get better, or there's going to be this weight lifted off your shoulders, or all of a sudden now you're going to be in the right rooms. And I really think that that is a fallacy in some ways. It's not as simple as that. You first are always going to have to establish a rapport, even if you have a trial period. And so I think it really is important to distill objectively what your needs as a creator, an artist, a songwriter, a producer may be, and then really ask yourself, well, do I need connections? Do I need to be in rooms? Do I need publicity? Do I need help with accounting, agreements? I'm not very good at speaking for myself. I'm a little shy. And then sort of really weigh that against 20% of your gross earnings and the accountability of also working with somebody. You are also responsible for that relationship. And are you in an appropriate place in your life to also manage that relationship and be accountable to that person? And so I find that, at least in my experience, there's always been those talks of, you know, I want a manager, I want a publisher, I want a record deal. And I think it's all the same, is that there is that viewpoint that things get easier from that perspective. But sometimes things can become a little more complex if not done at a steady pace where things can really be developed. I'll want to add that in there.
Definitely. Well, I mean, I love this. Let's talk a little bit about, you know, when you're talking about finding, as a producer, finding a manager to work with, or perhaps the other way around, actually, too. You know, if you're a manager who wants to work with producers, it's like, what are some red flags? This is kind of a very general question, but what are like some red flags for building your team or building your roster? Like what are some things that you would see and think, oh no, thank you.
Do you want me to start, Mike, or do you want to?
I mean, yeah, you go first. I only have maybe one red flag, but yeah, you go first.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking anecdotally, what comes to mind is, you know, maybe some recent discussions I've had in the last, you know, year or two when relationships aren't going well between the manager and the artist, or manager and producer. And I feel like a theme is typically a breakdown of communication on some level. And that could be, I think, maybe with respect to the roles and responsibilities of the manager, what they were supposed to do, what they were not supposed to do. I mean, anecdotally, I've seen a manager and artist relationship break down because the artist thought that the manager was going to be booking hotels for the artist, and the manager didn't do that. Anecdotally, I'm just mentioning. So it could be something as simple as that, although that doesn't happen every day. At least I hope it doesn't. So I think around roles, responsibilities, there needs to be expectations there. But I think also maybe on the other hand, maybe on the creative side, and I think it all goes to communication as well, when when the vision of the producer or the artist maybe is not understood. And so I think the manager and the producer need to be on the same page as to what that producer or artist wants. Like for all producers and artists out there, you know, the manager works for you. The manager works for you and not the other way around. And so obviously the manager should be there to help guide the producer artists and guide them through whatever it is they're there to assist with. But if that vision isn't there, if they're not moving in tandem to the same goals, I find that leads to issues. And again, I think it all comes down, I think, to maybe a breakdown of communication. I don't know, Mike, what do you think?
I think communication is very important. And I think with inside of communication, when it comes to any sort of team, be it management, labels, publisher, I really think a good way to test, your relationship with somebody is if you need to have a tough conversation, is there a level of combativeness in and around that conversation? Because at the end of the day, it is professional and not personal. And that's, in a perfect world, it should be professional, never personal. And there should be a clear distinction between a task conflict being, here's my vision or here's what I asked to have done and it was not done, and a relationship conflict. They are not the same thing in our industry. They are often very much confused. You are in a relationship with your manager, but there are levels to that. And I think when starting with somebody, or even well within a management relationship, 1 or 2 years, there should be a line that really is never crossed. There should never be any sort of pettiness or sort of punishment or negative energy or combativeness. I think it should always be a professional conversation. And so if professional conversations are not happening, that to me is a huge red flag on both parties. I mean, it works the other way around too. If you have an artist that's explosive and out of control and they use bad language or they swear at you or whatever, again, I don't think that is a healthy business relationship, and that would be a red flag for sure.
Yeah, definitely agree with everything you both just said. Definitely. And it's usually one of those things too, where it's like people show you who they are in the beginning of your interactions with them, in the beginning of any kind of relationship, whether it's business or personal. People will show you who they are, and you really have to be honest with yourself and pay attention, because usually behaviors are on display, and it's we all have done it.
And
try to push through.
In those behaviors, sometimes there are lots of people that are very good at hiding those behaviors, and they don't come out until, sometimes maybe too far in. And I think it's important to always be on the lookout for when people expose their true selves. And I see somebody sort of in the comments, right, trust your gut feeling. And I'm a big believer in trusting your gut, but I'm also a big believer in testing your gut. And trusting your gut sometimes can be not always the best decision when it comes to forming business relationships, and sort of testing that, adding that component in there is also important.
One thing I wouldn't mind adding, just because I'm thinking about a million things now, from a very practical legal perspective, and I might be stating the obvious to a lot of folks on the line, but if you get a chance, like if you're looking to maybe execute paperwork or something together, and you haven't worked together before, I always recommend a trial period, such that two people aren't sort of getting married for like 3 years out of the gate when they've never worked with each other before. I find oftentimes the best relationships, and I'm not saying the lawyer in the room is not saying you should do this, but oftentimes there are handshake deals in the industry, and we know about those, and two parties have been working together for a few years. Like I worked on a management deal, I don't know, about a year ago or so, where an artist was jointly managed by two other managers, and they'd been working together for like 7 or 8 years before they decided to put paperwork together. And I'm not saying people go that long without paperwork, but in that case, the parties are going to be really on the same page as to what that vision is, duties, responsibilities, all that kind of stuff. But in a scenario where the parties have not worked together, and if it's practical to do so, and if it makes sense for both sides, I would normally always recommend that trial period.
To go further on that too, Matt, in my experience, I am now of the mindset where agreement should always be tabled if you're working with somebody. I've done the handshakes, I've done the romantic sort of we're friends, and I don't want to come off as I'm not jaded or bitter or anything, but I have seen in my experience the situations where an agreement would have been nice, at least in terms of being able to refer back to something when things get a little sticky. And going on red flags here, I think anybody that doesn't want to sign an agreement with you, or at least interested in tabling something, even if it's just in an email, that's a huge red flag. This handshake romance of the past is just not necessarily the best way to work in this day and age for both parties. It protects both people, and it doesn't have to be expensive or long, or it can be developed and expanded upon. But if you're going to work with somebody, even if it's during a trial, throw something on paper, because it's good to know where you sit with people at any point.
Definitely, definitely. Well, speaking of paperwork, let's talk a bit about, let's move into producer agreements in terms of agreements for a producer working with an artist, or an artist hiring a producer. So there's a lot of things people have asked. I've read an explanation of what a producer point is so many times. I still don't understand. So I'd really like to understand that today, please. So yeah, Matt, if you want to start talking about that, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Where to begin? Points is probably a good place to start. And normally where I begin in producer deals is I'll put I'll put all royalties and compensation and payment more generally in a single bucket, because depending on the deal and depending on the producer's role, they could be remunerated in various ways. There, for example, could be an advance. So a lump sum fee in advance against future royalties, which means that the producer is also going to be getting master royalties. So all exploitations from the master, they'll get a piece of that. Potentially, the producer, as Mike alluded to earlier, sometimes producers are songwriters. They might also be wearing a songwriter hat, which means that they're not just a producer, it means they're also a songwriter. And so they'd be entitled to a portion of the musical composition copyright. So they'd be entitled to that sort of percentage of publishing revenue. And typically, when points are on the table, and it should be the case for producers, there, very likely is sound exchange royalties on the table, where the producer is essentially a performer on the master. And so for all digital exploitations of the master, they'd be entitled to their share of sound exchange royalties. Going back to the points piece, we can get into, I think, a lot of details on that, but I'd like to maybe just keep it simple. And then if there are further follow-up questions, I can either get into it, or if there's even more detail, people can kind of email me offline or whatever. But simply put, a point, when we're talking about points, we're talking about royalties from the master recording. We're not talking about publishing, we're not talking about anything else. We're talking about a royalty from exploitation of the master recording. And so a point, simply put, is a percentage of sound recording revenues. If you're getting 1 point, you're getting 1% of those revenues, 2, 3 points, 2, 3, etc. But the tricky, maybe complicated area is the follow-up question is to 1, 2, or 3 points of what? So I like to kind of almost divide it into maybe a scenario where an artist is signed to maybe a major label, and maybe a scenario where the artist is either independent or maybe signed to a record label where there's maybe a profit share, net 50-50 profit share deal. In the former, when the artist is signed to a major label, let's just say they've got a royalty from Universal or Warner or Sony of 20%. Well, if the producer is getting 3 points, well, they're getting 3% of that 20. When it comes to the all-in rate of 20%, the all-in artist rate of 20%, and the producer is getting 3 points, they're getting 3 out of that 20. And so essentially when it comes to those record sales, they're essentially getting 15% of whatever the artist gets, simply put. And in those deals where you've got a major label artist and you've got sort of a fixed kind of all-in rate, whether it's 15, 16, could even be 17%, whatever, that's typically how it works. Other times, if maybe there's no label, the artist is independent, or it's a net 50-50 deal, oftentimes what you'll see is instead of the 1, 2, or 3 points, the royalties on the master side are a percentage of net receipts. And so you can see anything as low as 5 to 8% of net receipts to something as high as 15, 20, even 25% of net receipts, depending on the deal. And what that simply means is the producer is getting 8, 10, 15, 20% of whatever it is the artist is getting. And you have to review those provisions, I think, carefully, both on the artist side and producer side, because in those sort of net receipts type deals, you have to figure out, well, what does net receipts mean? Is the artist, does the artist have to recoup, marketing and recording and in-pocket artist advances before the producer is going to get paid? Or conversely, is it just sort of recording costs and manufacturing costs the artist needs to recoup before the producer gets paid? So at a high level, simply put, I think the starting point is it's simply a percentage of master revenue. And then I think the complexities arise when you're talking about the sort of different types of deals, whether whether the artist is assigned to a major label and you've got maybe a deal structured that way versus more of a net receipts type of deal. So with respect to that first bucket in compensation, I would kind of throw all that in there. So is the producer a songwriter? Are they getting publishing? Yes or no? Are they getting an advance against future royalties? And that would obviously infer that they're getting a royalty of some kind. And are they getting sound exchange? I sort of look at that as the 4 kind of key compensation buckets for the producer. When does a producer get publishing songwriting split? That's a good question, loaded question. Mike, maybe chime in here as well. That's a tough question, and I see it pop up quite a bit. To Mike's earlier point about how maybe production has changed over the years, I think I don't want to necessarily say the norm, but especially in the R&B, hip hop, pop space, if the producer is, especially producers bringing the so-called beat or instrumental track, there's kind of an industry custom, I would say, Mike, feel free to chime in here, in that kind of genre, that so-called beat and instrumental track can sometimes often be 50%, 50% of the entire composition, with the performer on the track getting the other 50%. Other times it's not so clean. Other times, it could be a 33% share or a 10% share or an 8% share. It really just depends. And not to jump the gun on this, but there's always a practical answer and a legal answer to these sort of things. The legal answer is that from a Canadian law perspective, songwriting means an individual songwriter making a material or significant original expression towards the musical work. Period. A few other kind of nerdy parts to the test that we can get into another day. But I always use the example of, someone's making coffee and they're contributing to the vibe, or if someone says, hey girl, put a capo on the 3rd fret of the guitar, or whatever, likely doesn't meet the legal test. But practically, I meet some songwriters or producers that say, hey, Nashville rule here. Anyone that made coffee, anyone in the room, whatever, you're getting a piece of publishing. And Mike's shaking his head, and I don't ascribe to that whatsoever either. But again, legal answer and practical. Legal answer is significant material contribution to the work. The practical is, it's the Wild West, I think. And there are some industry customs, like I just described, but oftentimes I'll see files and it just, it's a little shaky as to what the rationale is as to why someone got songwriting credit when maybe they probably shouldn't have. I don't know. Mike, chime in on the songwriting piece.
And I mean, this goes back to, when I first sort of opened up, this question exposes one of the biggest issues of our industry right now to its core. And I'm a huge believer that it is the industry, not creatives, that is responsible in some way for fixing it, because we are, screaming this. I want to come back on this real quick about agreements. From my standpoint, your agreements set your precedent working forward in the future. And so working at getting your agreements consistent and clear will always work for you going forward, because it always gives you something to go back on and say, well, I did this way for this person, and that's how I want to continue working forward. Anyway, going into songwriting and publishing, songwriters, as Matt said, there's the legal side of it. You create an intellectual piece of property that consists of lyric and melody. It's not so clear as that anymore now with the development of modern technology. and the way the industry sets up writing sessions. Everybody now, more or less, depending on the scene you're in, gets together with a producer, songwriter, and artist. I call it the sort of, the trinity of the writing rooms these days, depending on what circle you're in. And we're all songwriters. There's no stepped process. Now that we are finished the song, we are going to go to a producer. Now there are still some scenes that happens in. It happens in Nashville. It happens in certain pop rooms, but generally the producer is there writing with the artist at the start. They're there with the songwriter at the start. Maybe they're throwing out lyrics. Maybe they have created 50% of the music, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're getting 50% of the publishing. And so I would say with this, there's always the practical side of this, and that is the most important side, because even if you do make coffee in the room, or you do change one chord or one lyric, you have to be a reasonable person. You can't just default to, well, I was in the room and so I get 33% because I'm this and I'm that. I think you have to always weigh in the residue factor in sort of the people after the fact of, are you entitled to this in a fair way? Did you contribute to the composition noticeably, where if we were to take that part out, the song would change? And so if you can't do a quantitative analysis of your contribution to the songwriting as a producer, then you shouldn't get publishing. But if you lay down 4 chords that sets the bed for music to be written over, then you are as equal as a songwriter as the person who writes the lyrics. And so to kind of get into the bigger issue of this, I mean, it's created a huge problem for the industry, because you have these terms of, I'm a producer and you're a songwriter and you're an artist. And well, what if the songwriter is also a producer? And what if the producer is also a writer? And what if we write a piano song and we just throw a vocal on it, but the songwriter comes up with 2 of the 4 chords? Are they now a producer? And it's created a sort of combat between producers and writers, because when we go back to the legalities around points and agreements and how we all get paid, songwriters get paid differently than producers. Songwriters, from a legality standpoint, don't have automatic right to points on the master. And there's a lot that believe they should. I'm myself included believe that they should. And this creates an issue, though, when we're all in the room and we're all sitting there together creating equally and writing equally, but we're getting paid differently. And yeah, okay, I stick around after and tune the vocals, but I think this discrepancy in terminology and sort of a lack of definition these days is creating a very gray area in terms of how we get or how we decide to compensate people and who gets what and what percentage. And there's different scenes that allocate differently and have different standards and different methods and different precedences. And it also comes down to how big you are. Do you have 21 number ones, or are you just starting out? And oftentimes the industry will use that against you. And so it becomes a case-by-case basis again. But this is a huge issue in the industry that needs to be addressed. I am a huge advocate for songwriter equality. I myself am a songwriter equal to being a producer. And we don't live in the world now of Lieber and Stoller and Holland and Dozer and John Prine and Lennon and McCartney and Nirvana and all these really great writers. Not saying there's not great writers now. All I'm saying is that there was this clear stepped process of, we wrote our song, Stevie Nicks wrote her song, or the Bee Gees wrote their song, and they brought it to a producer and it was produced. And now it is all happening more or less at the same time in the same room. And there is an expectation for a finished demo to be delivered shortly after, where the industry then can sit back and decide, is this good enough to be released or not? And I find that was not always the case. And it has created a lot of issues for creatives and for managers, I'm assuming, trying to navigate these deals and these negotiations after the fact, after everybody's come in and done the job and they're sitting on a great record.
Definitely. Yeah, we're touching on so many things. People are very appreciative of everything you're sharing here. So I guess, one of the things that Matt had mentioned in advance of this call was just with regards to this, and we've talked about this again, but it's just like getting that deal signed as early as possible. So can we talk a bit about, like, speaking of people working in a room together, can we just talk about split sheets and how maybe that can come into play and how that can help? No, Mike doesn't like it.
Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen.
Right. You're right. It doesn't ever
happen. There's never a split sheet at the end of a session. Maybe when I was 23 in Toronto, first starting out, I downloaded split sheets, or I would throw it up on SoCan. That doesn't happen. My day-to-day currently looks like, I look at my calendar, a songwriter and an artist is scheduled to come in. Maybe I know them, maybe I'm meeting them for the first time, and they come and show up, and here we are. Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you. Let's write a song. What would you like to do today? And then they leave. And you figure it out after. And that's just the way it is. Now, I'm not saying that's how it should be, but generally there is no deal. There's no deal until the industry has decided we like this. This is great. Or they've come to you directly and said, hey, we'd like you to produce this. We'd like to commission you. But even then, that's not, as depending on which world you operate in. This goes back to, you've got to choose what kind of producer or writer you want to be. But if you're operating in that mainstream sort of circuit, you are a writer until you are deemed the producer of the track, until someone literally buys your track, and then you're given the agreement. Then your team, your lawyers, your managers, your publishers are left to kind of go, well, he changed the chord to a B flat minor in bar 6, so he needs 5%. And well, the writer played the piano, so we want a point. And it's all left to sort of happen at the end. And again, this creates a lot of issues and delays in people getting paid,
Absolutely, Mike. We've talked about this so much
yeah.
offline as well. Yeah, I mean, to Mike's point, in a perfect world, you're going to have split sheets up front. In the perfect world, you're going to get those producer agreements signed ASAP. But oftentimes the reality is payment and a deal follows weeks, if not months and months after the sessions happened. I don't think we're going to solve that problem today. I think Mike and Andrea may be a session in and of itself just on producers getting paid and that sort of thing. But maybe going back to what Mike said earlier, develop that standard. Develop that standard as to how you're going to work as a producer, whether it's, X amount as an advance, 50% recoupable, provided I make a material contribution to the writing, maybe that's going to be determined in good faith following, and sound exchange of blank. If it's possible, set that standard, be consistent, and going back to the team's discussion, maybe that's a point in time when you need an advocate, when you need someone on your team to, advocate and work out those deals and those terms, weeks, if not months after the track, when the lawyer for the label or whoever gets involved who had no idea what the earlier discussions are, and they're just sort of doing what they think is standard and good for their client, when maybe there was a whole discussion beforehand. Often I've been in many situations where that producer, that artist just needed an advocate to make sure that what they were entitled to made its way to the paper. Made its way to the piece of paper that ultimately gets signed. But to Mike's point, the reality is, oftentimes this stuff is done after the fact. Oftentimes this stuff is done after the track is released. I've got many files.
Most of the time after the track is released.
Yeah, most of the time for sure. So I think Mike and Andrea and others who are listening to this, who are managers and producers, because you gave me the 1, 2, or 3, so we know who you are. If you have comments, if you have recommendations, suggestions, as to how things can work better on a day-to-day basis, that would be great, because sometimes it doesn't happen as cleanly as folks think. Sometimes it can. Sometimes you can have that split sheet up front. Other times, if it's sort of 2 or 3 parties that have worked together a number of times, there's already a standard set. They already know how each other work, and maybe 2 or 3 folks get into a room and they know songwriting, no matter what, is going to be split among 2 of them or 3 of them, just because that's the way they've done it for the last 10, 15, 20 tracks and sessions. But when they're one-off sessions with someone new, good to set that standard, try to vocalize that up front. And if you need to, have an advocate making sure that ultimately the piece of paper that gets signed is reflective of the arrangement and is fair.
I think it's generally understood that the split sheet now is just assumed everybody is equal until argued otherwise. But it is assumed if you're all in the room together now, you're all creating, but nothing ever happens so simply anymore, because if you pose this question, you work in a room with 3 people, say, okay, producer, writer, artist, and after the fact, the artist goes to another producer that wasn't there and they add stuff to the song. Now, maybe they didn't add something compositionally. Let's say they add some drums, or let's say they add some strings. Now, is that production or songwriting? Did the drums influence a specific rhythm in the melody that now constitutes songwriting? Is there a melody in the strings that is new to the composition that becomes a hook of its own? Or did this person just add arrangement components? And so they're not entitled to publishing, but they're coming for publishing. And maybe they're coming for equal publishing, but they weren't in the room. They didn't write the initial chord structure, the harmony, the melody, the lyric. And more often than not, they're getting publishing. And that has created a big rift between songwriters and producers, because those are these gray areas that keep on happening and will keep on happening until we as an industry better define some guideline or standard that allows us to look at and go, well, hey, just playing a new string part, but following the same chordal structure, that's not composition. That is arrangement. That is texture. That is producing. But again, they're kind of like this now. And so industry's responsibility to fix, but our responsibility as creatives to have these discussions and say it and do better in rooms. If you are a producer, advocate for your songwriters. Make sure they get their fair percentage. Make sure that they feel valued, and as a producer, definitely do not fight for what's not yours. Have some sort of standard for yourself.
I can't add to that at all. I agree with everything you've said, Mike, 100%. If I can, Andrea, I'd like to go way back. There was a question about ownership. What's the difference between copyright ownership of the master versus royalties? And so it's a good point. And when we're talking about producer agreements, this is sort of an item that you would normally see in the traditional sense. If there's a producer agreement between the producer and the artist, normally the producer is always assigning copyright. Any and all copyright that was created with respect to the sound recording is being assigned either to the label or to the artist. And sometimes you'll see, the American language work for hire language and that sort of thing, which essentially means that copyright is not the producer's. Copyright is going to the artist or the label, depending on the context. That would be sort of the run-of-the-mill, maybe producer agreement in the commercial context. But just because copyright ownership maybe goes to the artist or the label doesn't mean that the producer cannot get paid with respect to sound recording or master exploitations. And so that does not affect the points or the percentage of net receipts, or however we want to talk about it, that the producer is entitled to under contract. It just means that that producer doesn't own copyright to that sound recording. Of course, if they are a songwriter, which is a different copyright, and they have a piece of that, they would be entitled to their percentage share ownership of the composition or the sound recording copyright. So that's in the more traditional commercial sense. The other thing is there's probably a whole lot of other producers out there, maybe beat makers on BeatStars, or maybe other producers or beat makers that are in sort of the beat licensing world, and I act for some of those and have done some of those deals, those maybe look a little bit different. That's maybe, maybe the producers are in the business of, doing sort of non-exclusive licensing deals where the actual underlying beat or composition, underlying beat or sound recording continues to be owned maybe by the producer, but they are simply granting, the artist a non-exclusive license to that beat for a certain period of time. Everyone's going to be careful about those, especially artists, depending on how they want to use that work and use that beat. Because if the producer continues to own, the sound recording to that beat or instrumental track, well, the artist then goes on to sign a record deal or something like that, or purports to assign copyright in perpetuity to a label or something. Well, they can't do that if the producer retains that underlying instrumental or beat or sound recording. So just something to keep in mind moving forward. If you're a producer, so copyright normally gets assigned, but if you're in sort of a different business model, that's something to consider. And make sure you read those beat licensing agreements pretty carefully. Sometimes there's parameters around how long your license lasts. Maybe it only lasts for like 10 million streams, and maybe it's only good for one video. Some fairly arbitrary terms sometimes if you're grabbing a beat or an instrumental track from BeatStars, but maybe that's sort of a different discussion. But I think about that and that question around the difference between ownership and points. Does that make sense, Mike, Andrea?
It does. Thank you. It does. I'm glad you brought up the BeatStars aspect as well, because that was there were some questions around that, and we've all read the stories of the artists who licensed a beat and didn't really understand that they didn't then own it, and then it was like, oh, I have a multi-million stream hit, and then it's like, doesn't belong to you, and you're starting over.
I'm so sorry. Like one small thing, and then Mike, over to you. But just the last question there, I think is a really good one. Is it safe to say that the master copyright owner is the one who paid for the recording? Some producers have their own studios and will record for free so that they own the master. So sometimes what you see, so going back to my first example around, the traditional kind of commercial relationship, copyright to that sound recording usually goes to the artist or label. But there are situations where producers have their own studio. They want to invest in an artist. They're not charging a dime for 1, 2, 3, 6 records, whatever. And it's more of a joint venture kind of thing where the producer and the artist, co-own the copyright, the master, that is. So that's sort of maybe a different kind of deal, depends on the context. I've seen that before, and that can make sense. If an artist is looking to record an EP and instead of paying $50,000, they pay nothing. Well, maybe it does make sense for that structure because the producer ideally is, hopes to get paid one day. If if that artist signs with a major down the road and gets a big advance or something, normally that's kind of the business model associated with those deals. But a good question. I just wanted to throw that in there on the ownership piece.
And that way of working too is a great way of working. I've worked that way for many years in my career, especially in Toronto, going out to shows and seeing young bands, and being a young producer with not a lot of weight behind me. I mean, it was that, hey, let's work. I have a studio. I'm working at this studio. I have recording time, and, we can share in the masters. I'll own the masters until you pay me back or pay me up front. I mean, it is a great way to do development. It's a great way to build your own little unit, empire, team that you could then license to a label under a P&D deal. Or the artist gets signed to a label and you have shared ownership in those masters and you help broker that deal. And so, your payday is kind of in there with the artist's payday, and you all win together. So I think that's a great way of working. And I think as a producer, if you are giving up that time, if you are giving up that space, and you are helping foster development, you most certainly should have some stake in the masters. Again, reasonable. Don't be abusive with your power or overly controlling, but be upfront and determine what that looks like for you, so you feel value and you feel taken care of. I think it's a great way to work. And again, there's nothing wrong with putting it down on a piece of paper and just saying, hey, this is what we've agreed to, and each master is worth $1,000 each, and until we make that back, I'm going to maintain this much ownership of the masters.
I feel like, Mike, you've been talking more about getting things in writing than I have. So I feel like I should echo that and say, absolutely, get this stuff in writing. You know, we were talking earlier about the management deal and the trial period. And, you know, if the producer and artist are going to co-own copyrights, you need to sort of figure out that sort of business structure up front, because figuring all that out after the fact can get super tricky and hairy, especially around copyright co-ownership. If that wasn't discussed beforehand and the producer comes knocking, well, I've seen that create some really challenging situations. So 100% agree with that, Mike.
Definitely. So, you know, is that what you would recommend then in terms of some best ways that producers can protect themselves and their creative intellectual property? Is it only via agreements, or are there other things that people could do?
I think, you know, protection in this industry is a hard one. You know, I think it depends on your situation. If I look at it from a producer standpoint or songwriter standpoint, that generally comes down to your intellectual property. I'm sending my music around, maybe. Lots of people are hearing it. And so you have to just kind of do what's comfortable for you. I think putting metadata in your tracks or your songs, demos is very important. It doesn't have to be a producer tag always. It could just be Mike Sonier. Maybe you have a little logo that you put in the album artwork, and it's always consistent, and that just lets people know that this came from you. I mean, right? You hear it all the time with producer tags, and I think that's a great way to protect yourself. And also just be mindful of who you send stuff to. There are a lot of programs now, such as Dropbox or SongSpace or Disco, that allow you to manage your catalog and all the metadata that offer tracked links. So you can build a sort of analytical database of who's listened to my stuff, and did they download my stuff, or did they waste my time, or did they forget? Should I follow up here? Did they pass that link to 50 people? And now I'm wondering why 50 people are downloading my stuff. Do you feel comfortable with sending stems? Do you feel comfortable with sending stems before you get paid? That's a hard question. Do you want the cut? Do you want the money first? You know, and so you have to, there's no guarantee in this industry, and there's not a lot of ways to protect yourself. And if someone doesn't want to pay you, there's not a lot of recourse that you can do. And so my best advice is to stay open and to do what you can to just make sure that your intellectual property is traceable back to yourself. Keep your files clean, keep them labeled, keep your computer clean, keep records, keep backups, and just, you know, don't send things to people that you don't trust, and don't let anybody make you feel a way about that. If that's not you, then that's not you. That's that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with all of that. And like I said earlier, in the music business, there's a legal answer and a practical answer. I think Mike touched on all, you know, the practical side of this. And the practical answer, you know, the lawyerly thing to say, and the legal answer is get your pieces of paper signed up. If you can get split sheets, get them. Even if stuff takes a while to get, and to our earlier discussion, as Mike pointed out, sometimes it takes months and months, literally, to get paperwork signed up. Just get it done eventually, because I've been part of situations where it was actually never done. You know, the work was done, great cuts, they're out there, and now we're backtracking and, you know, figuring out, well, there were these 10 tracks that were released, and there were no advances and no royalties, and no one signed any sound exchange letter of direction, and publishing and all that sort of stuff was never discussed or solidified. And you know, SOCAN's not updated, and CMRA or SOCAN RR. No, I covered both sides there. No worries, SOCAN. It's practically, you need to get things signed up eventually. And so that would be my advice on the legal side, is don't overlook that. And the best way to protect yourself in that way is just getting it down in writing. Even following the session, I've had people just text each other. Like if there are 3 people in the session, you know, text songwriting or whatever. It's not perfect, but it's something. It's some kind of trail as to what the parties intended or discussed. And it's a whole lot easier to do that 1 or 2 days after the session than it is weeks or months after the session, and especially weeks or months after the track has been released and there's real money on the table, because then, surprise, surprise, you know, memories get a little bit foggy at that point.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, there was Byron, a publisher back in the chat, mentioned that they get all the contributors on one email and confirm the, you know, mentioned splits. and then they send out the split sheets to be signed. And I think that we talk about this a lot in our MMF sessions in general, so that's why I'm piping in. But yeah, I think the power of a follow-up email from a discussion, from a phone call, or like a meeting, is really important, as it does set some traceability and some sort of precedent for your agreement. Even if it's just for your own memory, you may be misremembering, like thinking, oh no, I'm owed 50%. It's like, no, 3 years ago, we said you were owed 15 or whatever it is. So yeah, don't be afraid to just say, send people an email saying like, great for the chat today, great for the session today, great for the, the coffee discussion about what our working partnership might be like. Just, this is what I took away from it. Does this make sense for you? And that's something that you can refer back to when you have to push to get it on paper later. So.
I think it's important, at least I feel the need to say this, that, I think it also depends on, I don't want to say what area of the industry you work in, but how you work in this industry. Because from, say, the majors or the major publisher standpoint, like none of this happens. Like, yes, publishers and managers have conversations behind the scenes, but in my experience, the only way you're talking about splits is if the song's coming out. And if you talk about splits prior to, it's just taboo. It doesn't happen. But people may be sort of on their, running their own studio, maybe operating outside of, say, a publisher. I call it the publishing circuit. But, I'm thinking of people who own studios that record all sorts of different kinds of projects. Union Sound is a great example in Toronto. You can go there. They have their in-house staff, their in-house owners. I've made a lot of great records there. And, maybe in a situation like that, if you get together or you're working with somebody and, maybe their business model is to throw a split sheet your way. But sort of my angle on this conversation has been coming from what it is like to operate in that, for lack of a better word, like that mainstream pocket with, these publishers and these labels, and these conversations are not happening, as transparently and after the fact, maybe as they should. And I don't know why it's not happening, but they're not, and I think it's really important that that as an industry, we develop some method for it to happen across the board, whether you are published, whether you are Max Martin or just starting out. We all deserve to be protected. And generally, just the bigger you are, you have somebody maybe in your back corner with publisher, manager, lawyer, whoever, sort of doing that follow-up. But again, there's very little talk unless there is some interest in the song from my world of that publishing circuit, being a published writer. When I was back in Toronto, even just developing artists, trying to get people deals, it was, understood, hey, we're all splitting this equally. But yeah, we never tabled stuff. And I'm not saying that was the right thing to do, but it's taboo, I think, is what I'm trying to say. There's this sort of like side of our industry that likes to talk about the right way to do things and all the sort of legal way. And you could read Don Passman's Everything You Need to Know About the Music Industry book and all these sorts of things, but that never